So as we dive in, we're going to be in chapter 41 of Genesis this morning. If you have a Bible, you can go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 41. That's where we're going to be hanging out. So we've been following along in the series through the life of Joseph. And if you've been here or if you've ever read anything, you know Joseph's life is pretty miserable up to this point. He has been betrayed by his brothers. He has been sold into slavery. He has been falsely accused. He has been thrown in prison. And then last week we saw where he was hanging out with these two guys, the cupbearer and the chief baker. And Joseph does something miraculous where he actually interprets their dreams to them, and the dreams that they have that he interprets come true. And the one guy, the cupbearer, he says to him, "Hey man, don't forget me, whatever you do. Please get me out of this dungeon." But we have what I think are probably the most depressing words to date in Joseph's life that come at the end of chapter 40, verse 23. It says, "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." And that is where we pick up this morning in chapter 41. This is my big sermon idea. This is the big sermon idea that it is wise to put our hope in God's past revelation and his future glorification. It is wise for us to put our hope in God's past revelation and his future glorification. First of all, because his truth is hidden to human wisdom. His truth is hidden to human wisdom. Let's pick up in Genesis 41 and read verses 1 through 8. "Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dream. But there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh." So 2 years have gone by. 2 years have gone by. I want to just for a second, think about your life 2 years ago. Think about your life 2 years ago. And really, if we're all honest, like how fast time has flown by. Now imagine yourself for those 2 years in a dungeon. Any volunteers? Any takers this morning? So that's Joseph's life. The scene leaves him in the dungeon 2 years later, and it appears in Pharaoh's dreams. And these dreams are a little bit interesting, right? They're a little bit crazy. Not necessarily because of their complexity, but they're almost crazy because of their simplicity. 7 fat, good-looking cows, right? Hanging out by the Nile, just having a good day. They see some of their skinny, not so attractive, ugly cow friends coming their direction, and all of a sudden, the skinny cows swallow up the big, fat, gaunt cows. And Pharaoh wakes up, as any of us would, because this is a nightmare, obviously. And you know what happens when you have a nightmare. You know, you kind of you wake up, you try to shake it off. You tell yourself, think happy thoughts, and you go back to sleep. He has another dream. This time, heads of grain, plump and full, just hanging out together. Then all of a sudden, their friends, the scrawny, not so attractive heads of grain, they come and they swallow up the big heads of grain. And again, Pharaoh wakes up and he's like troubled. He's like, man, this is crazy. I don't know what this means. And so he calls in all the magicians and all the wise men of Egypt to come in and interpret the dream. And this is going to set the context. This is going to set the context for the fact that a crisis demands godly wisdom. This is the conflict. In verse 8, he says, "Now in the morning his spirit was troubled. So he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh." How could these men who did not know God interpret a message that had been sent from God? That is the question we have to deal with in this text. Is this: how can any of us know who God is or know anything about God? How can any of us know who God is or know the truth of God? The biblical answer, the Christian answer is revelation. That we are in a bad spot because we have no ability to know who God is or know his truth unless he reveals himself, unless he comes down, unless he makes himself known to us. We have zero ability. We can't reach up into the heavens and pull back the curtain and peer in and see who God is. No, if we are to know who God is, God must come down. I'm sure in a room this size there are people who like to play games. Anybody like to play games? So games are fun. Games are a lot of fun. They're actually much better than television. So that's for free this morning. So you can play these games, have actual real human interaction. This is great, right? So you have real human interaction with people. And every game is fun because there's always like a secret involved. There's always some secret involved with the game that you have something in your hand or you have something that you're hiding from the other person that gives you the edge up. Anybody remember the game Battleship? So Allie and I played Battleship a few weeks ago. We were, just tired of watching TV, so we jumped in on the Battleship. And the thing about Battleship is there is this big wall that exists between their board and your board. If you play the game, you know what I mean. So there's a board, and there's another board, and there's this big wall that exists. And the goal of the game is to try to figure out what's on the other side of the wall. But you can't, obviously because there's this big wall in place. And that is a realistic picture of the relationship between God and humanity. That there is this wall, there's this dividing wall between who God is and who we are, between God's knowledge and our knowledge. It's kind of like this, when God created everything in an instant, when he created everything out of nothing in an instant, there were only two categories of stuff. There is created stuff, and then there is uncreated stuff. Or, another way to say it is, there is God, and then there's everything else. So there's this divide of being between who God is and everything else. And if that wasn't bad enough, there's this little thing called sin. Now, sin, we know, is something that we've inherited, but it's also something that we choose, that we have rebelled against God. So not only is there this divide of being between us and God, but we even decided to go our own way, to choose our own path, to rebel against this gracious God who has made us and made us for himself. And so there is this chasm. Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:14 says this, "But a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised." How can we know anything about God? We only know anything about God if God himself reveals it to us. I want to speak to you this morning. If you are not a Christian, if you would say, I have not placed my faith in Jesus, I have not trusted Christ for the forgiveness of my sins, I just want to ask you a question. How do you determine what truth is? How do you think through in your head, this is true and this is not true? What I've found in my experience, and this is where I feel like I used to be, and as I talk to other people, this is what I found, that a lot of times what we say about how we come to know what truth is very subjective. It is that I just don't feel like that is right, or that just doesn't sound good to me, or I just don't like the way that looks. That our experience of determining what truth is usually ends up being just simply what I think it is. And I want to challenge you this morning as we walk through this text, as we begin to read through this, to really ask yourself that hard question. Is what you believe to be true, are the convictions that you hold, because we all have them. We all have convictions. We all have these measures by which we live our life. What are they founded upon? What is the foundation that those are built upon? So, it is wise for us to put our hope in God's past revelation and his future glorification, because his truth is hidden to human wisdom, but also because he vindicates those who are his. Let's keep reading the story. We're going to pick up in verse 9 and read through verse 24. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. We had a dream on the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. And just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Pharaoh spoke to Joseph. In my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. And behold, 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile, and they were grazing in the marsh grass. Lo, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such as I have never seen for ugliness in all the land of Egypt. And the lean and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. Yet, when they had devoured them, it could not be detected that they had devoured them, for they were just as ugly as before. Then I awoke. I saw also in my dream, and behold, 7 ears, full and good, came up on a single stalk. And lo, 7 ears withered, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. Then I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. After 2 years, the cupbearer conveniently remembers Joseph, who had interpreted his dream. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but that happens to me all the time. You know, you inherited some important information and just happen to forget it until it conveniently becomes appropriate to remember it again. And then, it comes to mind at that moment. It happens to me in my marriage all the time. But, anyway, that's just life, right? That's just how it is. So the cupbearer, he conveniently remembers Joseph, and he begins to tell Pharaoh that there's this guy who has interpreted my dream before, and he interpreted it, and then it actually happened. And so Pharaoh goes down into the dungeon, and he pulls up Joseph, and here we are. This is like the apex of the story of Joseph, that he goes from being in the pit to the pinnacle of the palace. This is Joseph, who was, remember, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, wrongly accused, placed in prison, forgotten in prison, and now here he stands before the king of the most powerful nation that maybe has ever existed to interpret his dream. See, Joseph is standing exactly where God would have him be standing. Joseph has gone through exactly what God would have him go through. Joseph's humiliation has put him in perfect position for his vindication. That everything he's gone up to at this point crescendos at this moment where he rises up from the dungeon, he rises up from the ashes, and he's now standing in the palace, clean shaven, washed, standing before Pharaoh. This is the moment that he's been living for, that he's been waiting for, and God has orchestrated it all along. This is what a guy named John Chrysostom, he's a 4th century church father, this is what he says about Joseph's vindication. I love the way he puts it. He says, as it was, however, the wise and creative Lord, who like a fine craftsman knew how long the gold should be kept in the fire and when it ought to be taken out. Joseph, after being completely purified by endurance and emerging from the prison like some piece of glittering gold, he was brought in to Pharaoh's presence. I love that imagery that God left him in. He was a piece of gold. He left him in just long enough to refine it, just long enough that when he emerged, he was this glittering piece of gold. When I got engaged, I gave who is now my wife, an engagement ring. That's typically how that works. And it was so cool. My mom brought to me these few little rings that had some little, tiny diamonds kind of running along them. And she offered them to me to place them in Allie's ring. And it was great. If you see Allie later today, feel free to embarrass her and ask her to look at her ring. It'll be great. So if you were to look at her ring now, there are these little tiny diamonds that kind of run along the outside. And so I remember when I went to go pick up the ring after this fine craftsman had molded and made this beautiful ring that I was going to give to my wife, he also handed me this little baggie. And it had these 2 or 3 little circles of little bands that I had given him. But the only difference was that the diamonds had been plucked out of those rings so that it could be used in the engagement ring. And I think that's a really interesting and I think an accurate picture of what's happened in Joseph's life. He's had to be plucked out of some places so that he could be used for a more glorious purpose. And that is how God works in our life. He sometimes uses our crisis. Our crisis not only reveals character, our crisis refines our character. That God uses our suffering. He uses our crisis to make us who he wants us to be. In character out of crisis means that crisis reveals character, not only reveals character, but it refines character. This is what Jesus said. Jesus said, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Now the kicker is, Jesus is about 2 or 3 days away from dying when he said that. That he's saying that there's something beneficial about going through that death, because on the other side of that death, there is something worth going through the dying. That it was for the joy set before him that he endured the cross, that he died for our sin in our place, because he knew he would be resurrected. He knew he would be vindicated. And that future vindication, that future glorification gave Jesus the endurance and the power he needed to endure the cross. See, God not only uses our suffering to refine us, but our suffering is a reminder that one day, if we are his, we will be vindicated. Just like Jesus was risen from the dead, we too will experience that resurrection. But I have to be honest, we don't all get a Joseph moment. We don't all get to see our vindication on this side of the grave. And so it tests our hope. It tests our faith. Do we trust that God truly vindicates those who are his? And do we trust that because Christ was raised from the dead, God will make all wrongs right? So it is wise to put our hope in God's past revelation and his future glorification, because he vindicates those who are his, but also because he reveals himself as the author of history. Let's continue reading in verse 25. Now Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 thin ears scorched by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in the land of Egypt. And after them, 7 years of famine will come. And all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land, so that the abundance will be unknown in the land because of the subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. The scene is set for Joseph to give his interpretation. The magicians and all the wise men, they have no idea what Pharaoh's dreams are about. And so here, Joseph begins to interpret this dream to Pharaoh, but he does more than just interpret it. He doesn't, think about this. Think about it like this. If your life had been this bad for as long as Joseph had, over a decade, he's just gone through junk after junk after junk. Now he's standing before Pharaoh, and the interpretation that he's about to give him is not a favorable one. He is about to tell the king of the greatest empire that there is a famine coming. And not only is there a famine coming, but Joseph's God is the one bringing it. Will he tell Pharaoh the truth? Will he look him in the face and tell him the honest truth? And he does. Look in verse 25, 28, and 32. I want you to see this. Obviously, you can't look at all three of those at one time, but I'm going to do my best to sum it up. Joseph goes beyond giving him the interpretation, and he tells Pharaoh why God has given him the dreams. He says, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. So there's going to be 7 years of great abundance, right? Yeah, 7 years where the land becomes flowing, it's luscious, things are great. Yeah, God is going to bring that along. We're good with that, right? Everybody's good with that. God brings about the abundance. But then there's going to be 7 years of famine. And Joseph says, yeah, the famine, that's from God too. The abundance is from God, but the famine is also from God. In Psalm 105, the psalmist explains what he's seeing in Genesis. And he says, and he, talking about God, and he called for the famine upon the land, and he broke the whole staff of bread. Listen to this. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. When the famine came, it was because God called it. When Joseph got sent by his brothers through slavery to Egypt, it was because God was sending a man before them. And this is no different from the gospel message that we proclaim. Think about this. In Acts chapter 4, John and Peter, they're praying to God, and they're talking about what happened when Jesus died on the cross. And this is what it says. For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel. Those are the people that gathered together to crucify our Lord, to crucify Jesus. And they say that they are doing whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. When the famine came, God was the one who called it. When Joseph was sold into slavery, God was sending him before. And when Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sin, it was no accident. God was offering him up on behalf of us all for our sin in our place. We have to see that God's not afraid of suffering. He's not afraid of crisis. In fact, because he is the author of history, he has made suffering our servant. He uses our suffering for our good and for his glory. But the only way he can do that is if he is the Lord over it all. When we see God at the cross, that his son died for our place, what we see is this. God wrote himself into the story, but he wrote himself into the story as a suffering servant. He uses suffering in his master plan. A few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, it was Valentine's evening. My wife came in from work, and in our little one-bedroom apartment in Raleigh, there was water all over the floor. And she pulled out the boxes that we had set up. We had a little curtain with some boxes, and she pulled it out where it seemed like the water was coming from, and there was mold just caked all over the back of the wall. It was just like, oh my goodness. So we've moved 4 times in 2.5 years, and I'm so tired of moving. So tired of landlords. So tired of dealing with maintenance complaints and mold and leaks, and I'm just tired of it, right? So we're asking ourselves, it's funny because I'm working through this stuff. It's kind of hard to feel sorry for yourself when you're reading about Joseph, you know? It really is. But I'm sitting there thinking, what is God doing? Why is he writing into our story this moldy wall and this frustrating situation? Like, what is God doing? And honestly, I don't know. I really don't know everything that God's doing. There's always 1,000 things that God's doing. But this is what I do know. God is slowly chopping down this idol that Allie and I have in our hearts, that our home is our refuge. God is slowly tearing away from us this idea that the promised land is just a nice place to live in our own home with peace and quiet. No, see, God desires that we become like Jesus. And he's going to use little annoying things like mold in the wall to get us to release our hands from these things that we love and these things that we worship, to set our gaze on Christ and to become more like him. And now listen, I'm not naive to understand that there are people in this room who are going through really serious suffering, who are encountering really, really hard times. Man, I just pray that you will see in this that God uses all things. God uses the death of his son to be the most glorious act in human history, where he reconciles men to himself. God uses our suffering. For those who are his, he makes suffering our servant. And I pray that you'll see that as good news. It is good news that God is the author of history, because it means he can make our suffering our servant. It is wise to put our hope in God's past revelation and his future glorification, because he reveals himself as the author of history and because he grants grace and wisdom through them. That's kind of a weird way to word that sentence, but this is what I mean by that. The past revelation and the future glorification, they meet us in the moment. They meet us now in the present moment to give us grace and wisdom. Let's read. We're going to read 33 through 38. That's going to be the last verse we're going to go through this morning. Now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact a fifth of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Then let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up the grain for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority, and let them guard it. Let the food become as a reserve for the land for 7 years of famine, which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine. Now the proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. Then Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is a divine spirit?" Now this is a really interesting moment where Joseph is supposed to be interpreting Pharaoh's dream, but he does much more than that. He begins to tell the king of Egypt how he ought to rule his land. He starts to tell the king, you ought to do this and you ought to do that, and this is what we ought to do for the coming famine. Joseph is acting upon this, what he's received from God, this revelation he's received from God, and he's turning it into wisdom. He's turning it into action. But listen, Joseph could not have given Pharaoh advice until he himself saw what God was planning to do. It wasn't like Joseph walked in and he knew everything and he could just tell Pharaoh what to do. No, Joseph was completely dependent upon him knowing God's revelation. But listen, once he heard what God was going to do, he put his neck on the line for it. He looked at the king of Egypt and said, "This is what you ought to do." Joseph completely threw himself out onto God's revelation. When God said, "This is what I'm going to do," Joseph completely banked his whole life in this moment on God's revelation. And that is true godly wisdom. See, there were two men building a house. One man quickly built his house big and built it large. The other man took some time to dig underneath his property and find out what was down there. and he laid a good foundation. When the storms came, that man's house, it was unshakable. The other man who had built the grand house, the big house, when the storm came, his house collapsed. So the question this morning is, do we want to build our life on God's wisdom or on our own wisdom? Do we want to build our life on what God has revealed about himself? He already has spoken. He already has revealed himself. Are we going to be like Joseph, to take initiative, to use our wisdom that is in line with God's wisdom rather than our own? As it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the debater of this age? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in God's wisdom, the world did not know God through its wisdom, God was pleased to save men through the foolishness of the message that was preached for those who believe. Jews demand signs, Greeks demand wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. What a crazy message to stake your whole life upon. What a crazy story to say, I'm going to give everything, I'm going to put my neck on the line for Christ crucified? God's wisdom will always be foolishness to the world, and the world's wisdom will always be foolishness in light of God's revelation. We build our life upon what God has revealed, and what he has revealed to us is Christ crucified, Christ risen in our place for our sins. Why do we send missionaries? Why do people get on a plane, leave their homes behind, leave their families behind, ask people like you for money, take off to go live in a place where they've never met anyone, they've never spoken a language that they speak? Not because it makes sense to this world. They do it because God has revealed himself. And when God reveals himself, we stake our life upon it. Why do people in this room give of their tithes and offerings every week? Not because it's human wisdom, but because God has revealed that it's actually more blessed to give than it is to receive. Why do we love someone who we absolutely know will take advantage of us? We enter into relationships with people, we build friendships with people who we expect to stab us in the back, who we expect to take advantage of us. Not because it's human wisdom, but because God has revealed that all men need to know Christ. All men need to hear the good news of Jesus. And so even if we get stabbed in the back 1,000,000 times, we keep on doing it because it's godly wisdom, not human wisdom. Earlier, I mentioned to you, if you're somebody here today and you say, I'm not a Christian, I don't know Jesus, where have you built your foundation upon? Where do you hold your convictions to? What are they tied to? What anchor do what you feel good, what feels good, what doesn't feel good, what I think is and what I think is not? What foundation is that laid upon? The Christian foundation is this. It's not that we were somehow smarter than somebody else. It's not that we found the right path to God. No. The Christian foundation for life, for wisdom, is that God has come down. God has revealed himself. This is not Battleship. This is not a guessing game of us just shooting over the wall and hoping that we'll know who God is. No, God took on flesh, and he came and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, glory as of the only begotten, full of grace and truth. God has made himself known. I pray this morning, if you're like many of us in here who have tried to live another way, who have tried to build our life on some other foundation and have just time and time and time again watched it crumble, would you consider Christ this morning? Would you consider Jesus, the firm foundation? A few thoughts of application. A few thoughts of application as we look at this story. Genesis 41. Godly wisdom means we diligently study the written word and the incarnate word of God. We have revelation from God. This is the way Hebrews 1 puts it. In the former days, God spoke to the fathers through the prophets in many portions and in many ways. But in these last days, which that's another sermon for another day, but in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son. God has made himself known. Do we set our gaze on his revelation? Do we lift our eyes above the junk that gets pumped to us every day? Do we lift our eyes above that to what God has revealed about himself and about what he is doing in the world? We don't need a word from God. We have received the word from God, who is himself Jesus, who took on flesh. If you want to hear from God, read the scriptures, read the gospels, look at Jesus. That is how God speaks. That is how God reveals himself. Another application, godly wisdom means trusting God even when we are being treated unjustly. Do you wait well? Are you patient when things aren't going your way? Is it hard for you to think about somebody like Joseph? Remember, sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused, put in the dungeon, forgotten in the dungeon, and yet, what happened? Here he stands before Pharaoh, exactly where God would want him. God vindicates those who are his. And he calls us to trust him even when we are being treated unjustly. Another application, godly wisdom means we choose integrity and honesty at all costs. We choose integrity and honesty at all costs. Can we look the king in the face when no one else could? Can we look him in the face and say, a famine is coming and my God is bringing it? I know, Pharaoh, that you think you're God, but my God, he's bringing the famine. What kind of guts did it take for Joseph to do that? Will we be honest? Will we lovingly look our family member in the face, look our friend in the face, say, man, you need Christ. And if you don't put your faith in Jesus, there are severe, eternal consequences. Listen, guys, that's not fun. Nobody gets joy out of that. You think it was fun for Joseph to look Pharaoh in the face and tell him a famine was coming? But because God has revealed himself, godly wisdom means we use integrity and honesty at all costs, even if it costs us our life. A fourth application, godly wisdom means that the news that the world is going to hell in a handbasket is completely false. I wonder if you had asked Joseph when he got sold by his brothers, hey, Joseph, man, how's the world looking for you today? Or maybe when he got falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, hey, Joseph, how's the world looking today? Or maybe when he was in the dungeon, hey, Joseph, how's the world looking today? Or when he got forgotten in the dungeon, how's the world looking for you today, Joseph? Where is your God? And then he gets brought out of the dungeon, placed before Pharaoh to interpret his dreams, and we say, oh yeah, there's Joseph's God. And oh, by the way, he was there the whole time. Our world is not crumbling around us. Jesus is seated on the throne. He is risen from the dead. And every day, people are being brought from death to life. Let's get our eyes above this junk. All day long, we hear just negative, negative, negative. And look, there is negative and there is suffering and it is real, but Jesus is Lord over it all. He is reigning, He is supreme, and He is risen. Can we set our hope in a risen Savior? Can we set our hope in the fact that He has done everything necessary for our salvation? And He is calling us, and His Spirit is moving, and He is bringing people to life. We just get so stuck in like our little tiny corner of the world. We don't realize God is working all over the world. Every single day, people are coming from death to life. And one day, Christ will make all wrongs right. Man, let's get our eyes up. Let's get our eyes up into here, where God has told us the end of the story. Pharaoh asks a very, I think, astute question at the end of verse 38. I think it's a question that really, if we're all honest, maybe we're all asking. He says, can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit? And man, I think the New American Standard, I think they missed it. King James, ESV, NIV, NLT, Holman Christian Standard, they all translate it. Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? See, I think that's the question that Genesis is trying to answer. It's the question that the Bible is trying to answer. Can we find a man? Can we find one? And see, Joseph says, I'm not the man. Verse 16, it is not in me. It's not in me. But there's one coming. There's one coming who is God. We can find a man who will save us from our sins. We can find a man who will right all wrongs. We can find a man who will reveal God to us in our desperation, in our desperate need to know this God. We can find a man. His name is Jesus. He has come. He has put on flesh. He has dwelt among us. And it is wise. It is so wise